Hey woodworkers. So I want to talk about another joint that you might find useful for building anything from tables to chairs. There's really no limit as far as what this thing can be, but this is referred to as a bridal joint, and thinking about this can be considered very much an open-ended mortise and tenon joint. So with this, in essence, we have a tenon here without any shoulders, top and bottom, and this could slide in any orientation and then change the geometry of a piece. And so if I were to make a chair, perhaps this could be a bottom leg going into a back, or a table if these things were possibly at an angle, but if these shoulders were cut at 90 degrees, this could easily slip in here or slip in this orientation, and it just gives you another option for making some well-fitting joints. This one is a bit more severe, a bit more dramatic, so I want to talk about this one a little bit more. So with this joint, it illustrates a little bit more of the illustration of limitations of what the machinery can do. And so I have a piece that is 4 3/4 almost wide, and you'll notice that on the end of this joint, then the joint here, I'm not able to go that entire width of this piece. Let me remeasure this. This one is 3.5. So I have this gap here where I was unable to bring the joint all the way up to where my line needed to be, my shoulder. And that has everything to do with the extension of the blade height. If you're using a single blade to make this joint, you're going to have, on most 10-inch saws, you're going to have about 3 inches of vertical clearance for that blade. If you're using a dado blade, an 8-inch dado blade, then that becomes much shorter. It's about 2 1/4 inches. So keeping that in mind when laying these things out, so I had to make some accommodations for that to allow for this piece to be able to be cut across the blade this way. So that's why this one is cut short, is because of the limitation of the saw. So in cutting this joint, what I've done is I've laid out the parts and pieces here that need to be removed. I would encourage you to consider where in the alignment of what these things are going to do. Oops, where am I going here? That's what I'm doing. No, I want to go this way. That's right. Nope, can't go that way. Anyway, so I've laid these things out, and what I'll need to do is raise the blade up to this height here. And just like with any joinery, we usually cut out the negative space first. And so if we were cutting mortise and tenon, I'd be cutting out the mortise piece first, and this one is about where I want you for here. So I think I cut this one a little bit under 3 inches. I think at 2 3/4 or something like that. So anyway, that's where this one is going to go. What I want to do is create some type of a fixture to be able to slide this across the saw blade. If I were to do this freehand, that would be, as my dad would refer to it, that would be a good way to miss Christmas. So I have this little saddle that I've created for my table saw, so it fits over the fence obviously and runs freely, but there's no gap, there's no wiggle here. So within this, I'll be able to secure this piece here, and doing so, these angles match, so the geometry complements each other. I've screwed this little backing piece here. I've screwed this piece into a little plate that is removable from my sled, but the screws are nowhere near where the height of the blade is going to be, because I want to be able to cut through this to protect this board, as well as giving me the backing, the security of making sure that this piece does not move as I'm cutting. So everything is locked down and I'm in good shape for making my cuts. First thing I want to do is move the blade over. See if I can zoom into this a little bit better. It doesn't really matter which side you cut on, and there's kind of a couple of ways to approach this. You could, let me start over. Could start cutting more or less right in the center, or a little bit off center, and then work your way over. Because this piece is at an angle, it gets a little bit trickier. If I wanted to do the same operation, but on a 90-degree piece, or something that's 90 degrees to the bed, I can do one pass through with the sled, with a saddle, pardon me, and then flip it around, one pass through, and then they would be symmetrically cut. And so there's some benefit of doing that. And an angle piece, it gets a little bit tricky though. So that's why I don't love cutting right in the center. So I'm going to offset this, and I'm going to get as close to my line as I can on my left. So this guy over here first. And I'll continue to make these cuts. That looks pretty good. Until I advance over to the right-hand side, which means I'm going to move the fence to the left. And so going all the way through, all the way back, that should do it for me as far as how this thing goes. Let me do a first cut here, show you what that looks like, and then I'll be able to talk to you through next steps. Alright, this is going to be a dusty and a loud operation. So here in protection, eye protection, obviously, double checking my clamps. Alright, here we go. Do one more cut. So I slid, I shifted the height of the blade up a little bit after my first cut. It was too low, but the second cut looks like I'm right on my line, which is where I want to be. So now I need to take one more little pass here to just touch the very top of this, which I didn't do the first cut. So, probably should have talked about how I laid this out. I separated this material, the thickness of this material, in thirds. And so what I did in this first operation is I removed the center third of this cut. Hopefully you can see that. Yeah. So laying all these things out, I made sure to align these things where I wanted to go. Operationally, if I have more than one of these, which I would typically have, I would probably do one cut and then replace this board with the next board and do the same exact cut before I move the fence over. If I had a bunch of these things to do, then maybe what would make more sense is to set up some stop blocks on the side of the fence, so that if I move left and right, those stops will limit my travel so that I can repeat the cuts that I need to make for this operation. So just thinking about how to approach this and where this is going to benefit you. The thing about the first cut that I make is that it's somewhat arbitrary. I'm going to try to shoot for my lines, of course, but if it's a little bit off, I will adjust for it. I'll make up for it with this second cut. So with these, yeah, that's what I want you. Oh yeah, good. Pardon me. All right, so what I needed to do now is set up a situation where I can remove the bottom face and then flip this around to do the top face. Pardon me. In doing that, what I'm looking to do is set up my blade so that the very outside of that cutter is making contact with my lines. Hopefully this is better. Yeah, better. Thank you, cameraman Jeremy. You're welcome, Jeremy. Okay, so bumping this thing over. That looks good. I want to go to the other side here, make sure that I'm lined up. I am. That's good. All right, so I'm going to need my miter gauge in order to do this. I will use the one that came with the saw, which is great. I haven't used this since the last time I did this operation. And I'm going to sorry everyone. I'm going to adjust the angle here on this gauge. So I'll reference everything against my square, which has been locked down. That is the maximum width that I need to cut. Then I'm going to bring my miter gauge into place, and as long as this is nice and tight against the fence, that's the correct angle. And I can put this piece in. So I'll go through, starting at the end here, making sure that the height of my blade is accurate. And then what I'll need to do is, ideally I'll have a second miter gauge. What I would like to do is take off equal amounts off of both faces, especially when I start, because I want to fit the end of this piece into that first operation just to make sure this thing fits. So having a second miter gauge is so beneficial. I think if there is a reason to need justification to purchase an aftermarket miter gauge, which are typically superior to the ones that come with the saw. This video will function as your rationale in a court of law. If there's any reason that somebody would argue with why you need to do this, you could just show them this and say, well, Jeremy told me how to do it. And I think that will be bulletproof and Loctite. Alright, so going from there, the fence has not changed to the position of the blade, so I'm in good shape. I do want to move this over just a touch, but not close enough that I'm cutting into my blade. And then the other thing that I should probably say here is that I could, no, I don't like you at all. I could easily see the argument for, I like you a little bit less, for using a dado blade or a dado stack for this operation. And I think that that would save a lot of time with cutting these things off. But with a single blade, especially with a flat tooth grinds like these ones, I should be able to cut through this pretty quickly. I don't typically use dado blades often because I think with a flat tooth grind blade like this, I'm able to do most of what it is I want to do or choose to do, which makes life a little bit easier. All right, let me cut these. Okay, so this is as far as I wanted to go with this to do my test fitting. And yeah, I could tell right away that this is still too thick, which is great. I'm not sure if you could pick this up, but I can see my pencil lines still. So I'm really, really close, but I'm not quite there. So I'm going to raise up the blade a little bit because by raising it up on one face, and then flipping this around, I've basically taken off whatever adjustment I've made times 2. So let me do this one on both, and hopefully this will fit. Okay, so hopefully you can see this. I'll just continue this thing on until I get down to my line, obviously. What I'm going to have to do on this one is what I originally showed with this sample piece. Because of the limitation here and here, I'm going to have to make this one, after I trim all this stuff back, I have to take this probably to the bandsaw, trim this off, get into this little shoulder area with the chisel. But in essence, this will work nicely for the purposes of what I'm after. And the service quality here is pretty great. And this introduces the last point, which is I've seen a lot of people talk about doing this on a bandsaw, and bandsaws are great, but the smoothness of the surface of the shoulders is not ideal off of a bandsaw. It's still probably good for gluing, but I really want to make this as pristine as possible, so table saw is the way to go. The other issue is that on a bandsaw, bed here, fence here, I can come in with the saw cutting to my line and then bump the fence over, cut to the other line, but there's no way I can cut this angle. I'd have to tip this up into that operation. I won't do that freehand because that's crazy, so I'd have to build up some type of a jig to do that, and just less service quality and the jig thing. It just seems like the table saw is a faster option. The other thing that I should mention, and I promise this will be the last one, is that it's really easy for the blade to cut through this material, but some materials are harder than others, and that blade starts to drift just a little bit. So you may not get parallel cheeks on, or edges on this cut, so you may have to come in and modify the tenon piece to be able to fit in here. In other words, it might get narrower the further into this joint you go. So just be aware of that. It's easy enough to come in here with a block plane or even chisels to kind of fare these things out and get them to drop in. But otherwise, this is an incredibly strong joint, and for the purposes of the things I described, this will do you very well for good strength and longevity. If there's any concern about not having enough glue surface in this area, it'd be very easy to put a peg or some other type of a dowel thing across this grain, gluing this whole thing together, and then this is going to be a bulletproof joint for you. Okay, hope that was helpful. Good luck with your joinery.